When Sarah and Mark Thompson first laid eyes on the old Victorian house, they were entranced. It had a certain charm, a picturesque, faded elegance with a wraparound porch, gabled roof, and an attic window that seemed to watch over the street like an all-seeing eye. The price was right, the neighborhood quiet, and the space perfect for their two young children, Lily and Ethan. They were eager for a fresh start, a place where their family could grow roots. Little did they know, the house had its own plans for them. The first few days went smoothly. Boxes were unpacked, rooms were arranged, and laughter echoed through the halls. Yet, it wasn't long before the strange occurrences began. It started with small things, doors that were left open despite being shut, light bulbs that flickered erratically, and a persistent chill in certain rooms that no amount of heating seemed to banish. Mark brushed it off as quirks of an old house, but Sarah couldn't shake a growing sense of unease. It was Lily who first spoke of the whispers. One evening, as Sarah was tucking her in, Lily whispered, "Mommy, there's someone in the attic." Sarah's heart skipped a beat, but she forced a smile. "It's just an old house, sweetheart. You're probably just hearing the wind." But as Sarah left the room, she couldn't help but glance up at the ceiling, her eyes tracing the lines of the beams that separated them from the attic above. The next few nights, the whispers continued, soft and unintelligible, like the murmurs of someone speaking just out of earshot. Ethan started waking up screaming, pointing towards the attic door that now seemed to be slightly ajar every morning. Each time, Mark would reassure him that it was just his imagination, but the boy's fear was contagious. Sarah began to feel a creeping dread, a sense that something was watching them, something that lingered in the shadows of their new home. One night, while lying in bed, Sarah heard it clearly for the first time, a faint, rhythmic tapping coming from above. She nudged Mark awake, but by the time he listened, the sound had stopped. "It's probably just mice," he said, but there was a tightness in his voice. Neither of them slept well that night. And in the morning, they found Ethan's toys arranged in a perfect circle on the living room floor, even though he had been asleep all night. The realization hit them both: they were not alone in this house. As days turned into weeks, the strange happenings in the house only grew more intense. The once warm atmosphere of their new home began to shift, replaced by a cold, pervasive dread. Sarah found herself glancing over her shoulder constantly, her nerves frayed by the unending feeling of being watched. Mark tried to maintain a facade of calm, but even he couldn't ignore the unexplained events that seemed to escalate with each passing day. It wasn't long before Ethan's behavior began to change. He became withdrawn and fearful, refusing to go anywhere near the attic stairs. One evening, as Mark was reading to him, Ethan whispered, "Daddy, the shadow man doesn't like us." Mark's blood ran cold. He had never mentioned a shadow man, and yet Ethan spoke of him as if he were a well-known figure. "What shadow man, buddy?" Mark asked gently, trying to keep his voice steady. Ethan pointed towards the attic, his eyes wide with terror. "The one that watches me from the attic door," he replied, his voice barely a whisper. Meanwhile, Sarah's sleep was plagued by vivid nightmares. She dreamt of a girl, no older than Lily, standing at the foot of her bed with eyes that were dark and empty. The girl's lips moved, but no sound came out, and every time Sarah tried to wake up, she found herself paralyzed, unable to move or scream. When she finally awoke, drenched in sweat, she felt a presence hovering just outside her bedroom door. The attic's pull was growing stronger, its influence seeping into every corner of their lives. One evening, while doing laundry in the basement, Sarah heard a soft, melodic humming. It was faint, barely audible over the rumble of the washing machine, but it was there. She paused, listening intently, her heart thudding in her chest. The humming grew louder, more distinct, as if coming from the walls themselves. She backed away slowly, her eyes fixed on the dark corner where the basement light didn't reach. Suddenly, the humming stopped, replaced by a sharp, guttural voice that hissed, "Get out." Sarah dropped the laundry basket, her hands trembling, and bolted up the stairs. Mark, on the other hand, began experiencing physical symptoms. He would wake up in the middle of the night, gasping for air, feeling as if something was pressing down on his chest. During the day, he was plagued by headaches and dizzy spells that seemed to worsen whenever he was near the attic. One night, as he was brushing his teeth, he caught a glimpse of something in the bathroom mirror, a dark, distorted figure standing right behind him. He spun around, but there was nothing there. Just his reflection, pale and shaken. The tension between Sarah and Mark grew as the hauntings became more personal. Mark accused Sarah of letting her imagination get the better of her, while Sarah blamed Mark for not taking their children's fears seriously. The children's drawings, once cheerful and bright, now depicted dark, shadowy figures and sad, faceless children standing alone in a room with a single window that looked suspiciously like the attic. Desperate for answers, Sarah decided to do some research on the house. She visited the local library, where she uncovered a series of old newspaper clippings about the previous owners. One article caught her eye. It was about a tragic accident that had occurred in the house nearly a century ago. A young girl named Margaret had fallen from the attic window to her death. Her parents had locked her up there, believing she was possessed, and she had died trying to escape. The community had long whispered that Margaret's spirit never left the attic, trapped by her rage and despair. When Sarah returned home that night, she found the attic door wide open. Mark was sitting on the floor, staring blankly ahead, his face pale and his eyes glazed over. "I heard her," he muttered, his voice hollow. "I heard Margaret." Sarah's blood ran cold. She approached him slowly, her heart pounding in her chest. "What did she say?" she asked, dreading the answer. Mark turned to her, his eyes filled with fear. "She wants us to suffer, like she did." That night, the family made the decision to leave the house, at least temporarily. But as they packed their bags, the atmosphere in the house grew oppressive, almost suffocating. The air was thick with tension, and every corner seemed to hold a dark secret. Just as they were about to leave, a loud crash echoed from the attic, followed by a child's scream. They froze, their eyes locked on the attic door, which now seemed to loom larger than life, casting a shadow that stretched across the entire hallway. Mark took a step forward, his jaw set in determination. "I'm going up there," he said, his voice trembling but resolute. Sarah grabbed his arm, her grip tight with fear. "No, Mark, please," she pleaded, but he shook her off gently. "I have to know," he whispered, his eyes fixed on the dark void at the top of the stairs. He took a deep breath and began to ascend, each step creaking under his weight, the darkness swallowing him whole as he disappeared into the attic. Mark's footsteps creaked against the old wooden stairs as he climbed into the attic. The air grew colder with each step, an unnatural chill that seemed to seep into his bones. As he reached the top, he hesitated, the darkness thick around him. He fumbled for the light switch, and when he finally found it, the single bulb flickered to life, casting eerie shadows that danced across the cluttered space. Old furniture, dusty trunks, and forgotten relics filled the room, but it was the silence that unnerved him the most, heavy and oppressive, as if the very air was holding its breath. He stepped forward cautiously, his eyes scanning the room for any sign of movement. His heart pounded in his chest, each beat echoing in his ears. Then, he saw it, a small chest pushed against the far wall, half hidden beneath a dusty sheet. Something about it called to him, a strange compulsion that he couldn't ignore. He moved toward it, his hand trembling as he reached out to lift the lid. Inside, he found an old, tattered diary bound in faded leather, its pages yellowed with age. Mark carefully opened the diary, his fingers brushing against the brittle paper. The handwriting was neat but frantic, the words scrawled in a hurried, desperate hand. It belonged to Margaret, the girl who had died in the house all those years ago. As he began to read, a wave of cold washed over him, and he felt a presence close in behind him, a faint whisper brushing against his ear. He turned sharply, but the attic was empty. Taking a deep breath, he returned to the diary, his eyes widening with each word. Margaret wrote of her torment in the attic, her parents' cruel belief that she was possessed by an evil spirit. They had locked her away, convinced it was for her own good, but as the days turned into weeks, her fear and anger grew. She described hearing whispers, feeling unseen hands pulling at her in the darkness, and shadows that moved on their own. She wrote about a dark figure that would visit her at night, standing at the foot of her bed, watching her with eyes that burned like coals. Her writing became more erratic, her words filled with fear and despair, begging for someone to save her. Sarah stood at the bottom of the attic stairs, calling out to Mark, her voice laced with worry. When he didn't respond, she felt a surge of panic. She hesitated, fear gripping her, but she couldn't leave him up there alone. She slowly ascended the stairs, each step feeling heavier than the last. As she reached the top, she saw Mark hunched over the chest, engrossed in the diary. "Mark," she whispered, but he didn't look up. "Mark," she called out louder, her voice trembling. He finally glanced up, his face pale and his eyes filled with a strange mix of fear and fascination. "She's still here, Sarah," he muttered, his voice barely audible. "She never left." He handed her the diary, his hand shaking. As Sarah began to read, a chill ran down her spine. The air around them seemed to grow colder, and she could feel the weight of Margaret's presence, a heavy, oppressive energy that pressed down on her, making it hard to breathe. The room seemed to close in on them, the shadows growing longer, darker, more menacing. Suddenly, a loud bang echoed through the attic, making them both jump. The light flickered, casting the room into momentary darkness. When the light came back on, the atmosphere felt different, charged with a palpable tension. They heard the faint sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate, moving across the floorboards above them. "We need to get out of here," Sarah whispered, but as they turned to leave, the attic door slammed shut with a deafening crash, plunging them into darkness. Panic set in as they fumbled in the dark, their hands searching for the door. Mark banged on the wood, shouting for help, but the only response was the mocking echo of his own voice. Suddenly, the room was filled with a low, guttural growl, the sound coming from all around them, surrounding them. Sarah clung to Mark, her heart racing, as the temperature plummeted, their breath visible in the icy air. The growling grew louder, more intense, vibrating through the very walls of the attic. Then, just as quickly as it had started, the noise stopped. The silence that followed was deafening, a thick, heavy void that seemed to swallow all sound. They stood frozen, afraid to move, afraid to breathe, when they heard it, a soft, childlike giggle that echoed through the darkness. It was a sound that sent a chill down their spines, a cruel, mocking laugh that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. She's playing with us, Mark whispered, his voice shaking. She's not going to let us go. Desperate, Sarah reached for the chest, her fingers fumbling for the matches she had seen earlier. Her hands shook as she struck one, the small flame flickering to life, casting a dim, trembling light. She turned to Mark, her face pale and determined. "We need to destroy this," she said, her voice steady despite the fear coursing through her veins. "It's the only way to end this." Mark nodded, and together, they piled Margaret's belongings into the center of the room, the diary, the old toys, the faded clothes. Sarah struck another match, her hand steady now, and held it to the pile. The fire caught quickly, the flames licking hungrily at the old, dry wood. As the fire grew, the room filled with the sound of whispers, angry and urgent, swirling around them like a storm. The air grew thick with smoke, and they coughed, their eyes watering, but they didn't dare look away. As the flames consumed the last of Margaret's belongings, a high-pitched scream filled the attic, a sound of pure, unbridled rage. The walls shook, the floor trembled, and for a moment, it felt like the whole house was about to collapse around them. But then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the noise stopped. The fire died down, leaving only a smoldering pile of ash. The oppressive weight that had filled the attic lifted, and the air seemed to clear, the cold dissipating. The attic door slowly creaked open, and a shaft of light pierced the darkness. They stood there, breathing heavily, their bodies trembling with a mix of relief and fear. Sarah turned to Mark, her eyes wide with disbelief. "Is it over?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Mark nodded, though he wasn't entirely sure himself. "I think so," he replied, his voice hoarse. They made their way down the stairs, the weight of what had just happened settling over them like a heavy blanket. As they reached the bottom, they heard Lily's voice from behind them, soft and haunting. "Margaret isn't gone," she whispered, her eyes staring blankly ahead. "She's just hiding." The next few days were a blur of restless nights and tense, quiet days. The family tried to return to some semblance of normalcy, but the events in the attic had left a lingering unease. Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that something was still watching them, hiding just out of sight. She found herself constantly on edge, flinching at every creak and shadow. The atmosphere in the house was oppressive, the air thick with a sense of impending doom. It was as if the house itself was holding its breath, waiting. Then, Sarah's behavior began to change. It started subtly at first. She became more withdrawn, spending hours staring blankly out the window or sitting silently in the living room, her hands clenched tightly in her lap. Mark noticed but chalked it up to stress. They had all been through a traumatic experience, after all. But as the days went on, her behavior became more erratic. She began to wander the house at night, her footsteps echoing through the halls. Mark would wake up to find her standing at the foot of their bed, staring up at the ceiling with a vacant expression. One night, Mark woke to find Sarah gone. He searched the house frantically, his heart pounding in his chest, before finally finding her in the attic. She was standing in the center of the room, her eyes closed, humming softly to herself. "Sarah," he called out, but she didn't respond. He approached her slowly, his hand reaching out to touch her shoulder, but the moment his fingers brushed against her skin, she spun around, her eyes wide and wild. "She's here," she whispered, her voice a low, eerie monotone. "Margaret is here." Mark recoiled, a cold dread settling in his stomach. "Sarah, you need to come downstairs," he said, trying to keep his voice calm. But she shook her head, her eyes unfocused. "I can't," she replied. She won't let me. She turned back toward the window, her gaze distant. She's so angry, Mark. She wants us all to suffer like she did. Mark felt a shiver run down his spine. He knew he had to get her out of there, but as he reached for her, she let out a piercing scream, her body convulsing violently. Downstairs, the children woke to the sound of their mother's screams, their eyes wide with fear. Ethan clutched Lily's hand tightly, his small body trembling. "What's happening?" he whispered, his voice shaking. Lily shook her head, her eyes locked on the attic door. "I don't know," she replied, her voice barely a whisper. "But I think it's Margaret." The house seemed to grow colder, the shadows creeping in around them, pressing close like a dark, suffocating shroud. Mark managed to carry Sarah downstairs, her body limp and unresponsive. He laid her on the couch, his hands shaking as he tried to wake her. "Sarah, please, wake up," he pleaded, his voice thick with fear. But she remained still, her eyes fluttering beneath closed lids, as if in the grip of some terrible dream. He knew he needed help, someone who could understand what they were dealing with. Someone who could help them banish whatever dark force had taken hold of his wife. He called a local historian who had a reputation for knowing the town's darker history and a paranormal investigator who had dealt with similar cases before. They arrived at the house later that day, their faces grim as they listened to Mark's account of what had happened. The historian, a stern-looking woman with sharp eyes, nodded slowly. "Margaret's spirit is vengeful," she said. "She suffered greatly, and she wants others to feel her pain. But she's not just a ghost, she's something much darker now, something that feeds on fear and suffering." The paranormal investigator, a tall man with a calm demeanor, added, "We'll need to perform a cleansing, but it won't be easy. Spirits like Margaret don't let go without a fight. She's found a way to anchor herself to this house, and to your family. We need to sever that connection, or she'll continue to haunt you." Mark felt a wave of despair wash over him. He glanced at Sarah, who still lay motionless on the couch, her face pale and drawn. "Do whatever you have to do," he said, his voice barely more than a whisper. "Just help us." They began the preparations for the cleansing, drawing protective symbols around the house and lighting candles at each corner. The air was thick with tension, the atmosphere charged with a sense of foreboding. As they moved through the house, chanting softly under their breath, the temperature began to drop. The lights flickered, and the shadows seemed to stretch and twist, moving of their own accord. The children huddled together, their eyes wide with fear, as the house creaked and groaned around them. When they reached the attic, the air was so cold that their breath came out in visible puffs. The historian and the investigator began chanting louder, their voices strong and steady. Mark held Sarah close, whispering reassurances to her, though he wasn't sure if she could hear him. Suddenly, the room was filled with a deafening roar, a sound that seemed to come from the very walls themselves. The candles flickered violently, and then, one by one, they were snuffed out, plunging the attic into darkness. In the pitch black, they heard it, a soft, childlike whisper that seemed to echo all around them. "You can't make me leave," it said, the voice laced with malice. The house seemed to settle after that night, its oppressive atmosphere lifting just enough for the Thompsons to breathe a little easier. But the sense of unease never truly left them. Sarah and Mark decided it was best to get away for a while, to let the house cool down, as Mark put it. They packed a few bags and took the kids to a nearby motel, hoping that some distance would help them regain their composure. But even away from the house, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. Over the next few days, Sarah noticed changes in herself. She felt a strange pull towards the attic, even when they weren't in the house. It started with dreams, vivid, terrifying dreams where she was locked in the attic, pounding on the walls, screaming for someone to hear her. Then, during the day, she'd catch herself staring blankly into space, lost in thought, her mind drifting back to the house, to the attic, to Margaret. Mark tried to reassure her, but even he was starting to feel the strain. The kids were jumpy, unable to sleep, their eyes constantly darting to the motel door as if expecting something, or someone, to burst through at any moment. One evening, Sarah caught herself standing in front of the motel's mirror, her reflection staring back at her with eyes that weren't her own. They were dark, hollow, and filled with a sadness that seemed to reach out and pull her in. She quickly turned away, shaking off the feeling, but it lingered like a cold hand on her shoulder. Desperate to understand what was happening to her, Sarah contacted a local historian who specialized in the town's darker history. The historian, a woman named Helen, was reluctant at first to talk about the house. "Some places are better left alone," she warned. But when Sarah pressed her, Helen reluctantly agreed to meet. Over coffee in a dimly lit diner, Helen revealed that the house had a long history of tragedies, each one more disturbing than the last. Margaret wasn't the first to die there, and she wasn't the last, Helen said, her voice low. "There's something about that house, something that draws in darkness. It feeds off of it, grows stronger with each tragedy." She paused, her eyes narrowing. "And I think Margaret's spirit is a part of that now. She's angry, confused, and she doesn't want to be alone." Helen leaned in closer, her voice dropping to a whisper. "I've heard stories of people being possessed by her spirit, reliving her torment over and over. If you're feeling her presence, it might already be too late." Sarah left the diner in a daze, Helen's words echoing in her mind. She returned to the motel, but she couldn't rest. That night, she dreamt again, this time of Margaret standing at the foot of her bed, her eyes dark and accusing. "You took everything from me," Margaret hissed, her voice a low, guttural whisper. "Now, it's your turn." Sarah woke up with a start, her heart pounding, sweat pouring down her face. She felt a coldness in the room, a presence that seemed to press down on her from all sides. She turned to wake Mark, but he was already awake, staring at her with wide, frightened eyes. "She's here, isn't she?" Mark whispered, his voice barely audible. Sarah nodded, unable to speak. The air grew colder, and the room seemed to darken around them. Suddenly, the lights flickered, and the TV turned on by itself, static filling the screen. Over the hum of the static, they heard it, a faint, melodic humming, the same sound Sarah had heard in the basement weeks ago. It grew louder, more insistent, filling the room with a low, resonant hum that seemed to vibrate through their bones. Sarah clutched Mark's hand, her grip tight with fear. "We have to go back," she whispered, her voice trembling. "We have to end this." Mark nodded, his face pale but determined. They packed up the kids and drove back to the house in silence, the air heavy with dread. As they pulled up to the driveway, the house loomed before them, dark and foreboding, its windows like empty eyes staring back at them. The attic window seemed to glow with an eerie light, a beacon in the darkness. They entered the house cautiously, the floorboards creaking beneath their feet. The air inside was thick with cold, and the silence was deafening. They made their way to the attic stairs, their steps slow and deliberate, each one feeling like it could be their last. As they reached the top, they saw Sarah standing in front of the chest, her back to them. Sarah?" Mark called out, his voice trembling. She didn't respond. He took a step forward, reaching out to touch her shoulder, but as his hand made contact, she turned around sharply, her eyes dark and hollow, filled with a rage that wasn't her own. "Get out," she hissed, her voice distorted, a low, guttural growl. Mark stumbled back, his heart racing. "Sarah, please, it's me, Mark," he pleaded, but she didn't seem to hear him. Her eyes were fixed on the chest, her hands clenched into fists at her sides. "She's not here," Sarah whispered, her voice a chilling monotone. "She's never leaving." Mark looked around frantically, searching for anything that might help. His eyes landed on the chest, and he remembered Helen's words, "The spirit is bound to something in that house." He knew what he had to do. He grabbed a nearby candle and lit it, the flame flickering in the cold, dark air. "Sarah, listen to me," he said, his voice steady. "We're going to end this. We're going to set her free." He held the flame to the chest, the wood catching fire almost instantly. The flames roared to life, consuming the chest and everything inside it. As the fire grew, Sarah screamed, a high-pitched wail that filled the attic, shaking the very walls around them. The room seemed to warp and twist, the shadows growing longer, darker, more menacing. Mark held on to Sarah, his grip tight, refusing to let go. "It's okay, Sarah," he whispered, his voice steady. "It's over. She's gone." But as the flames died down, the room fell silent, the oppressive weight lifting. Sarah collapsed into Mark's arms, her body trembling, her eyes filled with tears. "Is it really over?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Mark nodded, holding her close. "I think so," he replied, his voice thick with emotion. But as they turned to leave, a faint whisper echoed through the attic, a soft, childlike giggle that sent a chill down their spines. "I'm still here," the voice whispered, "and I'm never leaving." The days following the fire were a blur of confusion and fear. Despite their efforts, the atmosphere in the house had only grown more sinister. The once quaint and charming Victorian now felt like a prison, its walls closing in with every passing hour. The air was thick with tension, an unspoken dread that settled over the family like a dark cloud. Sarah could feel Margaret's presence more strongly than ever, her grip tightening around her psyche, pulling her deeper into the void. The children became more withdrawn, their faces pale and haunted. Lily, who had always been a cheerful and imaginative child, now stared blankly at the walls, her eyes hollow and lifeless. Ethan refused to sleep, his small body trembling with fear every time the lights dimmed. Mark, determined to find a solution, contacted a local paranormal investigator, a man named George, who had a reputation for dealing with hostile spirits. George arrived one evening, a tall, imposing figure with a calm demeanor. He carried a large bag filled with various tools, candles, incense, and a collection of old, worn books. As he set up in the living room, he explained the process to the family. "We're going to perform a seance," he said, his voice steady and reassuring. "We need to communicate with Margaret's spirit, understand her pain, and help her move on. If we don't, she will continue to torment you." Sarah and Mark exchanged worried glances but agreed. They had tried everything else, and this seemed like their last hope. George arranged the candles in a circle, placing a single, large candle in the center. He lit the candles, one by one, murmuring a prayer under his breath. The room was filled with the soft glow of candlelight, the flickering flames casting eerie shadows on the walls. As the seance began, the air grew colder, a chill settling over the room. George closed his eyes, his hands hovering over the central candle. "Margaret, we call upon you," he intoned, his voice low and commanding. "We seek to understand your pain, to help you find peace. Come forth, and speak to us." The room fell silent, the only sound the faint crackling of the candles. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, the temperature dropped sharply, the candles flickering wildly as a cold wind swept through the room. The walls seemed to close in, the shadows growing darker, more menacing. Sarah felt a tightness in her chest, a pressure that made it hard to breathe. She glanced at Mark, his face pale and tense, his eyes wide with fear. Suddenly, the central candle flared, its flame leaping high into the air, casting a blinding light that filled the room. A soft, childlike voice echoed through the room, faint and distant. "Why did you leave me?" it whispered, the sound sending a chill down their spines. "Why did you make me suffer?" Sarah's heart pounded in her chest, her breath coming in short, ragged gasps. "We didn't mean to," she whispered, her voice trembling. "We want to help you, Margaret. We want to set you free." The room grew colder still, the pressure mounting as the voice grew louder, more insistent. "You can't help me," it hissed, the sound filling the room, reverberating through their bones. "You can't change what happened. You can't bring me back." The walls seemed to close in further, the darkness pressing in from all sides. Sarah felt a hand grip her arm, cold and unyielding, pulling her towards the center of the circle. She struggled, her heart racing, but the grip only tightened. George's voice cut through the darkness, firm and commanding. "Margaret, listen to me. You don't have to be alone anymore. Let go of your anger. Let go of your pain." The pressure eased slightly, the grip on Sarah's arm loosening. For a moment, the room seemed to calm, the darkness receding. But then, the voice returned, louder and more furious than before. "No! You can't make me leave. This is my home. This is my pain." The central candle flared again, the flame growing brighter, more intense. The room shook, the walls vibrating with a low, rumbling sound. The children screamed, clutching each other in fear. Mark moved to protect them, his eyes wide with terror. Sarah felt herself being pulled towards the attic stairs, her feet moving against her will. She tried to fight it, but the force was too strong, too powerful. She felt herself being dragged up the stairs, the darkness closing in around her. As she reached the attic, the door slammed shut behind her, plunging her into darkness. The air was thick with cold, the chill seeping into her bones. She could hear Margaret's voice, soft and menacing, whispering in her ear. "You're mine now," it hissed, the sound sending a shiver down her spine. "You'll never leave." Sarah felt a surge of panic, her heart racing as she searched for a way out. But then, she remembered Helen's words, "Margaret's spirit is bound to something in this house." She knew what she had to do. She reached for the chest, her hands trembling, and opened it. Inside, she found a small, worn doll, its face cracked and faded. She knew this was it, the source of Margaret's torment. She grabbed the doll and held it to her chest, feeling its cold, lifeless weight against her. "Margaret," she whispered, her voice steady despite the fear coursing through her veins. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry for what happened to you. But you don't have to be alone anymore. You can let go. You can find peace." The air around her seemed to shift, the darkness lifting slightly. She felt a presence, warm and comforting, wrapping around her like a blanket. She knew it was Margaret, her spirit finally at peace. The door to the attic slowly creaked open, and a soft light filled the room. Sarah felt a weight lift from her shoulders, a sense of calm settling over her. She turned to see Mark standing in the doorway, his face filled with relief. "It's over," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. "It's finally over." Mark rushed forward, pulling her into his arms, holding her close. "Let's go home," he said softly, his voice filled with love and relief. As they left the house, the sun began to rise, casting a warm, golden light over the world. The house stood silent and still, its shadows finally at rest. The family drove away, leaving the past behind, ready to start anew. But as they disappeared down the road, a soft whisper echoed through the attic, a faint, childlike giggle that lingered in the air. Margaret was gone, but her presence would always remain, a part of the house, a part of its history, forever.